Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. AMD's Ryzen 3 1200 versus Intel's i3-8100 Coffee Lake CPU. Which should you buy? These are both about $110 to $120 in price. They are both 4-core, 4-thread processors. They both have great performance for casual gamers, casual content creators, budget PC builds. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you a bunch of different benchmark charts testing both games and non-gaming applications on both of these processors. I will show you overclocked performance of the Ryzen chip because it is unlocked, the Intel is not. I'll talk a bit about the motherboard choices and the pros and cons relative to each CPU. Now, linked down in the video description below will be links to Amazon and Newegg for different motherboards and both of these CPUs and my suggestions as to what I think you should buy if you're looking to build a budget machine with one of these CPUs. First, a quick recap on the Ryzen chip, then I'll talk some about the new Coffee Lake processor. The Ryzen 3 1200 is the entry-level Ryzen 3 processor launched in 2017. 4 cores, 4 threads. It has a base clock speed of 3.1 gigahertz, a turbo speed of 3.4, and an XFR speed of 3.45. Not much of one there, but it is unlocked, and on B350 or X370 boards such as this one, it can be manually overclocked to higher speeds. I will show you fixed 3.7 gigahertz overclock results later in this video. Very easy to do that. Go into the BIOS, set a multiplier of 37 because it's based off of 100, save the changes, reboot, no voltage changes or anything, all on the stock cooler. It does just take a few minutes. Now, if you want the performance of the overclocked chip that you see in this video, but you don't want to go into the BIOS, you don't want to violate the warranty, you don't want to worry about any instability, and you want guaranteed results, for $20 more, this chip is $110. For $20 more, you can buy the Ryzen 3 1300X. Same cooler. The difference is it has an out-of-the-box turbo speed of 3.7 instead of 3.4, and it's XFR auto overclocking. That does not violate the warranty. It does it automatically. 3.9 gigahertz. So you will get roughly similar performance out of the box of the 1300X that you do to the 1200. If you're okay to spend the $20 so you don't have to mess with it and it just does it for you automatically, by all means. If you're okay to go in the BIOS and do it, save yourself $20 and get the 1200. Please note that none of the Ryzen CPUs, at least at the end of October 2017 when I'm filming this, have any integrated graphics. You will have to buy a graphics card to use the Ryzen 3, 5, or 7 CPUs. Sometime in 2018, they are supposed to be coming out with APUs, which have integrated graphics, but those have not been announced yet, but they are expected to be coming. The Intel chip does have integrated graphics. I'll talk about that when I come to Coffee Lake, but do be aware these do not have integrated graphics. Now, as far as motherboards go, most people should go with a B350 board. If you get the 1300X, you could actually go with what's called an A320, but you don't save much, $10 or $20 on the board, and you give up future upgradability and future overclocking. So I would get a B350. You can get them for less. This one here retails for about $100 and is very feature rich, but you can find B350 boards between $60 to $70 if you're willing to give up some features. I would not recommend the X370 boards for a chip like this. Those are really meant for the higher end Ryzen 5s and Ryzen 7s. They cost more, they have more features, and if you're looking for a board like that, you probably should buy more processor. So really the B350 is the recommended chipset for any of the Ryzen 3 chips. One quick important point about the B350 boards. It is possible to buy the Athlon X4 950 or the new A12-9800. I have those right here. Yes, I've tested them. I'll include the A4 950 results later in this video as well. Short answer, don't buy these CPUs. They are previous generation 28nm excavator chips. If you don't know what that means, that's okay. In short, don't buy either of these white box chips. Ryzen 3 1200 is the lowest end you should buy. It is true that the A12-9800 does have integrated graphics, which technically gives you an APU available today on the AM4 platform. The performance is dreadful. I'm not going to show you that in this video, but I have tested it. In fact, the CPU is not in here because it actually is in my test bed. Skip the white box CPUs. Ryzen is great. These are yesterday's technology and frankly should be skipped. Now we have Intel's i3-8100 4-core, 4-thread, 3.6 GHz, $120 8th generation Coffee Lake CPU. Yes, that's a mouthful. This is the first time that the i3 generation has been 4 true processing cores. If you've avoided i3s in the past, be aware that prior to this generation, prior to October of 2017, these were all dual-core chips. They're now 4-core chips, so that is a big change. It is a doubling of processing power. In addition, the clock speed has been increased. 3.6 gigahertz on 4 cores is excellent. This processor is faster than the previous generation's i5 4-core, 4-thread locked processors. Not the K chips that are unlocked, but all of the locked and non-K processors, this will beat. Now, it's not worth upgrading from an older i5 of the past few years to this. Upgrade to the new i5, and I will cover the new i5 compared to Ryzen 5 in a future video, not here, because the new i5s are 6-core, 6-thread. That's a 50% increase, also brand new for the 8th generation. But here we have 4 cores, 4 threads. We have a stock cooler that is more than adequate to cool this processor. I rarely saw the temperatures get above 50 degrees, ran cool, ran quiet. If you are buying or building a budget machine, use the stock cooler. It's just fine. You may notice that I have a Z370 motherboard here. You will have to get a 300 series motherboard to use any of the 8th generation processors. They are not backwards compatible with the 100 or 200 series boards. However, the B and the H series, the budget boards from Intel, have not yet been released. I am recording this in October of 2017, the same month that this launched. Only the Z370 has come out. All of these boards are currently at or above $100. You can find these for $60 to $70. These are over $100. There are B and H boards, B360 and H370 boards that will come in early 2018. If you're not ready to upgrade just yet, but maybe you're watching this in early 2018, there will at some point be under $100 boards available. Yes, you can overclock on a Z series board. No, you can't overclock this because it is not a K chip. If you want to overclock, if you want to get really high performance, but you really only need 4 cores, not to worry, Intel's got you covered. The i3-8350K. 4 gigahertz out of the box. It does not come with a cooler, please note, like this does, because you need to provide your own cooling. But this will easily overclock to 4.7 gigahertz or beyond. Many of you will get 5 gigahertz. Is it worth it? Maybe. That's a topic I'll cover in a future video, and the results for this are not in this video, and here's why. This is $180. This is actually $10 more expensive than the Ryzen 5 4-core 8-thread processors. I will compare this to the Ryzen 5 1400 and 1500X in a future video, but the price of this puts it out of contention with the Ryzen 3 series chips. This will be compared to Ryzen 5 in a future video. One advantage of buying a Z board today, even if you're buying a locked processor, is future upgradability. Perhaps either later in the 8th generation or perhaps 9th generation, which I fully expect to work on these because Intel usually has 2 generations per board and we're at the start of a new generation. You could upgrade to a higher performance K processor and overclock it in the future. So perhaps you're not ready to spend a lot of money today, you're on a budget. You can spend $120 to $150 on a nice quality mid-range Z board, buy this budget processor, and then in a year or two upgrade to a higher end K chip and you don't have to change your motherboard. So if you need to do your system in stages, that is one benefit of a higher end board today. Speaking of upgradability, it would only be fair to talk about that on AMD's side as well. AMD has promised 4 years of upgradability for the AM4 platform. What that means is you should be able to buy this today, use your CPU, use it for the next 3 years, and then upgrade to whatever the then newest Ryzen CPU is at that time, and still install it on your existing B350 or X370 board. That is definitely a +1 for AMD over Intel, who replaces their motherboard socket every 2 years, so half the upgradability time frame of AMD. I mentioned before the integrated graphics. This is definitely a +1 on the Intel side. While the integrated graphics in here is not good enough for AAA games, you're not going to be playing Ghost Recon Wildlands on this processor without a dedicated graphics card. You could absolutely play Overwatch, League of Legends, World of Tanks. Rainbow Six Siege will run on this. You can play a variety of those type of games. And of course, it'll do everything in Windows without a problem, saving you the cost of adding a graphics card. So if you're on a budget, buy a premium motherboard, an entry-level CPU, upgrade to a faster graphics card or a graphics card at all in the future, and then in the next 2 years you can always upgrade the CPU to a 6 or possibly more core chip in the future because you've got the Z series board. Now, I mentioned before that AMD will be coming out with an APU that comes with integrated graphics with the Zen cores sometime next year, probably right around the time that the budget boards from Intel come along. So what you may end up with is a $120 to $150 budget chip with an integrated graphics sometime in 2018, and then there'll be $70 Intel boards to go along with their chip. So those will probably cancel each other out. Not to worry, when it comes, I will review it. One question worth considering is, what do you have to be upgrading from to make either of these worth considering? In other words, what does your current machine need to be? How old does it need to be? And what processor would I consider either of these to be upgrades to? Now, first of all, let me be clear. If you have any of the FX-based processors from AMD over the past 5 years, the FX 6300 or 8300 or anything in those series, I really don't think either of these is much of an upgrade. In some respects, they're faster, but in others, they're not because of fewer threads. Likewise, from Intel, if you have any of the i5 or i7 processors from the past 6 years, going back to second generation Sandy Bridge, these aren't much of an upgrade. The i5s are all 4-core, 4 threads. These are 4-core, 4 threads. Are these faster than a 3 or 4-year-old i5? Yes. Not by much. To be honest, it's a very, very minor upgrade. If you have an i5 or an FX series processor, I would go to at least a Ryzen 5 or an Intel i5 processor at a minimum. These I would consider to be more of a side grade rather than an upgrade from those. On the other hand, do you have an older Athlon X4 or even X2 processor? Do you have one of AMD's A8 or A10 APUs from the previous generation? Do you have an i3 Pentium or Celeron chip from Intel? Those are all 2-core chips. Yes, these would be an upgrade, and yes, then they are worth considering depending upon what you're doing. So if you're on one of those older CPUs or lower-end CPUs, these could very well be a substantial upgrade. Now, as I said before, I will show you the best of the Athlon series, the Athlon X4, in the benchmark charts in just a minute. And as you'll see, both of these processors completely crush it. All of the chips that you're going to find from the older generation, the Pentiums, the Celerons, all the Athlon X4s, will be no faster than that or slower than that. So essentially, these are big upgrades, just not from like an FX 6300 or an i5. If you have those, again, i5 or Ryzen 5 at a minimum. I mentioned at the beginning of this video casual gaming, casual content creation, basic budget PC use. These absolutely will play many current AAA games. Rise of the Tomb Raider, Ghost Recon Wildlands will in fact play and play reasonably well on these chips. But we are at the very, very end of 4 cores and 4 threads being enough for AAA gaming. We are rapidly approaching the time where that really doesn't provide enough to handle it anymore. It does, kind of, sort of today, but we are at the tail end of it. If you are interested in buying a processor for the next 3 years and AAA gaming, Battlefield 1, Call of Duty World War II, Mass Effect Andromeda, if you want to play those games, an i5 or a Ryzen 5 would be the minimum CPU I'd suggest. They do cost a bit more, but not that much more, and they're going to provide you with a smoother experience. Now, for the next 18 months, let me be clear. They're not necessarily going to be a faster experience in terms of average and max frame rates. What they will do is uplift your minimums. They will smooth out the frame delivery. Those extra threads from the Ryzen 5 and i5 chips don't necessarily make the game run faster. They make it run smoother. They reduce the hitching and the stutters, and they produce smoother frame pacing. So if you've got an extra $50 to $70, the Ryzen 5 and i5 chips for AAA gaming are much better choices. But you can get by with these for the time being. I have, in fact, played Ghost Recon Wildlands on both of these. It does stutter a bit. It does hitch a bit. It is not as smooth. I can tell the difference. But it is, in fact, completely playable. If you're on a tight budget and you got to wait a year before you can get better, you can get by with these for AAA gaming for a year or so. One last point, then we'll get to the benchmarks. If you are looking at this going, this is a $100 motherboard, and you've been talking about $60 to $70 motherboards, what's the deal here? Now, this isn't meant to be a motherboard comparison, but I do want to point something out. This is a $70 motherboard. This is an MSI Gaming Pro motherboard, and it is about 30% less expensive than this one. What's the difference? Well, it's not because this is ASRock and this is MSI. ASRock makes $60 to $70 boards as well, and MSI makes $100 boards. The difference is 2 RAM slots versus 4. No Crossfire support, AMD's Crossfire support. This is missing some additional features. The audio chip is going to be of lower quality compared to a board such as this. Oftentimes the LAN chip is not quite as good. The power delivery components on these budget boards are often not as good. None of that really matters for a Ryzen 3 CPU. You're not going to be pulling enough power or doing enough with this for the differences to make a big difference to most people. If you think you might want to upgrade in the next couple of years, if you think you'll use this for a year or two and then go to a Ryzen 5 or Ryzen 7, you might want to spend the extra $30 now to get yourself a board with 4 RAM slots and better power delivery and more expansion capabilities and more ports on it. It is a little bit more money now, but you do get a more capable board. But you can get less expensive boards, which you currently can't do on Intel, at least until early 2018. Okay, enough with the comparison and talking. Let's take a look at some benchmarks. The first test I want to show you is PC Mark 10. This is a free download you can run on your own machine. It takes 20 to 30 minutes and it tests everything. Everything from basic Word document editing to spreadsheets to image editing to web browsing to video conferencing. It's a very thorough test of everything that you might do on a modern Windows machine. The Intel i3-8100 is about 22% faster than a stock Ryzen 3 1200. This is largely due to the clock speed. Overclock a Ryzen 3 1200 to 3.7 GHz, and that drops to 12%. As I said before, if you want the red bar, the overclock performance without having to worry about overclocking, spend $20 more, get the Ryzen 3 1300X, and that's about the performance you'll get, plus or minus a few percent. As promised, the purple bar is the Athlon X4 950. I've previously covered that CPU. Don't buy one. Its performance really is dreadful. In fact, this makes it look better than it really is. It is night and day. If you have an older Athlon X4 or even X2 or a Core 2 anything or an old Pentium or Celeron chip, those will all generally be even slower than this, making these new 4-core chips worth upgrading to either Ryzen 3 or the i3. They're both great. Next up, we have CPU-Z, another free utility you can download, run the built-in benchmark. These were run with 1.8.1. Important because the benchmark results change with version numbers. You can see here that once you overclock a Ryzen 3 to 3.7 GHz or use the 1300X, then both the single and multi-threaded performance between the i3-8100 and the Ryzen 3 is almost identical. Notice that a Ryzen 3 1200 at stock does dip below it, which is why I suggest overclocking it or spending the $20. And then this shows the true performance potential of the Athlon X4 950, which frankly is pretty bad. Next up, we have Cinebench R15, the multi-threaded CPU bench, as well as the OpenGL test. Now, the exact same graphics card was in both machines, making the graphics comparisons exactly comparable. Notice we have 604 points versus 569 points with the Ryzen 3 1200 overclocked, and then a noticeable drop when it's running at stock speeds. Now, yes, the i3 does win here, and the i3 really is, in some respects, 10 to 15% faster than the Ryzen 3 when overclocked, but this is a fairly minor difference, especially when offset by the fact that you can buy much less expensive boards for the Ryzen 3, at least in October 2017 when I'm recording this. When there's $70 boards for the i3, this will be offset a bit. But yes, the i3 is a bit faster, but not by much. 7-Zip is a file compression decompression utility with a built-in benchmark. Basically, take your files, make them smaller, and then open them up to make them bigger again. The one really interesting result here is the Athlon X4 did fairly decent in the decompressing test, although it was very slow in compressing. Again, you can see here Intel wins across the board, but just by a bit. Once you overclock that Ryzen 3 to 3.7 GHz or use the 1300X, it's really, really close. 3D Mark is a 3D graphics benchmark that primarily uses the graphics card but also uses the CPU. Each one of these tests does include a CPU component, and you can see that reflected in the results here. TimeSpy and Firestrike 4K are almost entirely graphics card bound, which is why all the scores are so close. But you wouldn't build or buy any of these machines for 4K gaming or high-end gaming, or you shouldn't anyway, but I do include the results because I include them for all the CPUs that I test. Now, Firestrike, the one on the far right, that is at 1080p, and there you can see the difference with the older CPU versus the Ryzen and the Intel. Notice that, again, once you overclock the Ryzen, it's right up there with Intel. It's only at stock clock speeds that it's a little bit behind, but it's very, very competitive across the board. Now we have Group 2. These are older tests, Skydiver, Cloudgate, and Ice Storm Extreme. Notice that the spread between the i3 and the Ryzen 3 splits a bit more, especially in Ice Storm Extreme, which is a much older test. This CPU is far more key here than the graphics card. In fact, we're really almost entirely CPU bound. Notice that the Intel chip is faster. To be truthful, if you take the cost of the motherboard out of the equation, if the prices are equal, I would buy the i3 all day long. But the reality is in October of 2017, when I'm filming this, the prices are not equal. The motherboards do cost about $50 more on the Intel side, and that does throw the equation off, which is why I think for most people, the Ryzen is a great value for the money. If, however, you're watching this video when the motherboards are equal in price, when the B360 boards are out and there's no price difference, maybe consider the Intel. It's very competitive. Are you interested in virtual reality? These CPUs are VR compliant. They do pass the Orange Room test, which is primarily what is used for the current VR systems, the HTC Vive and the Oculus Rift. The scores over there are high enough, the frame rates are high enough that they will play current VR games reasonably well. Just as I said earlier in the video, where the lifespan of AAA gaming on these CPUs will be quite limited, it will be quite limited here as well. If you're really honestly spending the money on a VR headset, I would hope you're buying at least an i5 or Ryzen 5, if not an i7 or Ryzen 7. But at least for now, in 2017, and probably throughout a lot of 2018, these will work for most of the current VR games. Now, the blue room on the right-hand side is a future test. No current VR games use it. It's completely GPU locked, which is why there's no difference whatsoever in the results. That's mostly there to provide an analysis of how well future graphics cards run on future VR games. 3 more graphics benchmarks for comparison purposes. Lots of people use them, especially Heaven on the left and Superposition on the right. Now, Superposition was run 1080p medium detail. Notice it's really the Athlon X4 that falls apart here. The others are all pretty much graphics card bound. Just going to show that if you are playing anything that is graphics card limited, the CPU matters far less than the graphics card does. The second page for these tests, they also give a numerical score, which I'm including here for reference, so you can compare these to other CPUs and other reviewers. All 3 of these benchmarks are free to download, free to use. Run them on your own machine and see how much faster or slower these are compared to your computer. Finally, we come to the game tests. 8 games tested, 1080p, high detail. This is the average frame rate chart. In just a minute, I'm going to show you minimum and then maximum. We have a new chart layout in this video. It's different than my previous comparisons. What I've done is separated out average, minimum, and max into separate charts so that I can put all of the results next to each other for easier comparison. For example, Rise of the Tomb Raider. The blue bar is the i3-8100. The red bar is the Ryzen 3 1200 stock. The yellow bar is the Ryzen 3 1200 overclocked, and the gray bar is the Athlon X4 950. Notice that all 3 of our modern CPUs are pretty close to each other. This is because at 1080p at high detail, even with a GTX 1070, note this is not max detail, we are still mostly graphics card limited. Now, this is not true for the Athlon X4 because frankly it does not have the performance to keep up with modern graphics cards in modern games. This is why I say skip it, avoid it. It doesn't matter how cheap it is. It's just not worth building a new system around. But in terms of the modern CPUs, let's come over to For Honor and the Division, for example. Notice that all 3 CPUs at the 3 different clock speeds, 149, 145, and 151. These are indistinguishable from each other. We are still limited by our graphics card. The Division is 108, 105, and again 108. You would have to put in a 1080 or more likely a 1080 Ti before you really started to see very many of these numbers diverge. Now, you do a couple of times Grand Theft Auto 5, which is more CPU bound than it is graphics card bound. Rainbow Six Siege, also more CPU bound. Look at that, 200 frames per second average in Rainbow Six Siege at 1080p high detail. That's crazy. The short answer here is buy as much graphics card as you can afford. For those of you curious, Ghost Recon Wildlands, second from the right, if you were to turn it to ultra detail at 1080p with this GTX 1070, it would be below 60 frames per second. You actually need at least a 1080 and really to some extent a 1080 Ti to play that game at ultra at 1080p at over 60 frames per second. Crazy, huh? Moving on to minimum frame rate, this is the minimum chart, you'll notice something different. Ryzen pulls ahead, especially when overclocked to 3.7. I've said this in my previous reviews for the past 7 months on Ryzen. Ryzen is, in general, not as fast as Intel, but it's smoother. It is an amazingly smooth running processor. It handles multiple threads, multiple cores, and multiple processes very, very well. Remember, this is on DDR4 2666. I know some people say Ryzen needs fast RAM to do well. It really doesn't. It does just fine here. Rise of the Tomb Raider, For Honor, Grand Theft Auto 5 all had higher minimums on the Ryzen chip when overclocked to 3.7 than the Intel chip at 3.6. Our third chart is the maximum frame rate. Notice that Intel pulls ahead again in most of these games. Grand Theft Auto 5, for example, 172 versus 142, even when the Ryzen 3 is overclocked. You can see Rainbow Six Siege, again, the maximum 369 frames per second versus 312. Now, to be sure, those are kind of silly numbers. Who's going to even need that kind of frame rate? We don't have monitors that run that fast, but it's there if you need it. Rise of the Tomb Raider, so on. Other games like Mankind Divided are much closer, but when it comes to average and maximums, the Intel is often a touch faster than Ryzen, but I find Ryzen does really, really well in the minimums and in the smoothness of game performance. These are both great processors. You really will not go wrong with either one of them. Well, there you have it, a whole bunch of benchmarks and results, gaming and non-gaming. I hope that was useful and informative. As you can see from the charts, the overclocked Ryzen 3 1200 is very, very close in performance and occasionally beats the i3-8100. Now, at stock speeds, it is in fact slower, and if you don't plan to overclock, I would strongly advise you spend the $20 more to get the Ryzen 3 1300X. As I said at the beginning of the video, it'll all be linked down in the description below. But if you are okay to overclock, you should have no problem getting at least 3.7 gigahertz out of this using the included cooler, possibly more if you're okay to play around with voltage or tweak the settings a little bit, but everybody should get 3.7. And again, spend $20 if you want to avoid it, get the 1300X, and then you don't have to do anything. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with the big huge red button directly below. Questions and comments in the comment section, and as always, please do me a favor, check out the links in the video description. It really does make a difference. Amazon and Newegg for everything I've discussed on here. If you found this video helpful and useful when you're doing your shopping, please click those links when you go to buy. It really does help me out. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.